In this lecture, we will review the stigma of mental illness. In my previous lectures, I presented the fact that mental health care can be sought out in a variety of ways. We discussed the differences between abnormal behavior and clinical psychology. Now, the problem is that many people who need care never seek it out. Why is that? We already know that society dictates what is considered abnormal behavior through culture and social norms, and you can likely think of a few implications of that. But to fully understand society's role in why people do not seek care, we need to determine the psychological processes underlying this phenomenon in the individual. In reviewing research on the stigma of mental illness, I found an article from wsu.edu to be the most accurate. To begin, before we even get to the subject of stigma in itself, let us gain a deeper understanding in regards to social cognition. Social cognition is the process through which we collect information from the world around us and then interpret it. The collection process occurs through what we know as sensation, or detecting physical energy emitted or reflected by physical objects. To learn more about social cognition, I have a whole series based on social psychology that takes a deeper dive into this subject matter. Now, detection occurs courtesy of our eyes, our ears, our nose, skin, and mouth, or via vision, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. Once collected, the information is relayed to the brain through neural impulse, where it is processed and interpreted, or meaning is added to this raw sensory data, which we call perception. Now, one way meaning is added is by taking the information we just detected and using it to assign people to categories or groups. For each category, we have a schema, or a set of beliefs and expectations about a group of people believed to apply to all members of that group. And based on experience, you may have some biases there. You might think of them as organized ways of making sense of experience. So, it is during our initial interaction with someone that we collect information about them. We assign the person to a category for which we have a schema, and then we use that to affect how we interact with them. First impressions, called the primacy effect, are important because even if we obtain new information that should override an incorrect initial assessment, the initial impression is unlikely to change. We call this perseverance effect or belief perseverance. Stereotypes are special types of schemas that are very simplistic, very strongly held, and not based on first-hand experience. They are heuristics or mental shortcuts that allow us to assess this collective information very quickly. One piece of information, such as skin color, can be used to assign the person to a schema for which we have a stereotype. This can affect how we think or feel about the person and behave towards them. Again, human beings tend to imply things about an individual solely due to a feature and disregard anything inconsistent with the stereotype. Okay, now social identity theory states that People categorize their social world into meaningful, simplistic representations of groups of people. These representations are then organized as prototypes or quote-unquote fuzzy sets of a relatively limited number of category-defining features that not only define one category but serve to distinguish it from other categories. We construct in-group and out-groups and categorize the self as an in-group member. The self is assimilated into the salient in-group prototype, which indicates that cognitions, affect, and behavior we may exhibit. Stereotyping, out-group or in-group, out-group bias, normative behavior, and conformity are all based on self-categorization. Now, overlapping with prejudice and discrimination in terms of how people with mental disorders are treated is stigma. Now, there's that word that we're going to focus on. Or when negative stereotyping, labeling, rejection, and loss of status occur. Now, stigma takes on three forms. You have your public stigma, label avoidance, and self-stigma. Let's start with the first. So, public stigma is when members of a society endorse negative stereotypes of people with a mental disorder and discriminate against them. They might avoid them altogether, resulting in social isolation. An example is when an employer intentionally does not hire a person because their mental illness is discovered. Next is label avoidance. To avoid being labeled as quote-unquote crazy or nuts, people needing care may avoid seeking it altogether or stop care once started. Due to these labels, funding for mental health services could be restricted and instead physical health services funded. And the next is self-stigma. When people with mental illnesses internalize the negative stereotypes and prejudice and in turn discriminate against themselves. They may experience shame, reduced self-esteem, hopelessness, low self-efficacy, and a reduction in coping mechanisms. An obvious consequence of these potential outcomes is the why try effect, or the person saying, why should I try and get that job? I am not worthy of it. Okay, now another form of stigma that is noteworthy is that courtesy stigma, or when stigma affects people associated with a person who has a mental disorder. In a research study resulted that families of the affected were often blamed, rejected, or devalued when others learned that a family member had a serious mental illness. Due to this, they felt hurt, betrayed, and an important source of social support during a difficult time had disappeared, resulted in greater levels of stress. To cope, some families concealed their relatives' illness, and some parents struggled to decide whether it was their place to disclose their child's condition. Others fought with the issue of confronting the stigma through attempts at education versus just ignoring it due to not having enough energy or desire to maintain personal boundaries. There was also a need to understand the responses of others and to attribute it to a lack of knowledge, experience, and/or media coverage. In some cases, the reappraisal allowed family members to feel compassion for others rather than feeling put down or blamed. The authors of this study concluded that each family develops its own coping strategies, which vary according to its personal experiences, values, and extent to other commitments. And that coping strategy families employ change over time. Other effects of stigma include experiencing work-related discrimination, resulting in higher levels of self-stigma and stress. Higher rates of suicide, especially when treatment is not available, and a decreased likelihood of future help-seeking intention. The results of the latter study also showed that personal contact with someone with a history of mental illness led to a decreased likelihood of seeking help. This is important because 48% of the university sample stated that they needed help for an emotional or mental health issue during the past year, but did not seek help. Similar results have been reported in other studies. It is also important to point out that social distance, a result of stigma, has also been shown to increase throughout the lifespan, suggesting that anti-stigma campaigns should focus on older people primarily. One potential disturbing trend is that mental health professionals have been shown to hold negative attitude towards people they serve. Hansen and colleagues in 2011 found that staff members at an outpatient clinic in the southern part of Sweden held the most negative attitudes about whether an employer would accept an applicant for work, willingness to date a person who had been hospitalized, and hiring a patient to care for children. Attitudes were stronger when staff treated patients with a psychosis or in inpatient settings. In a similar study, to help deal with the stigma in the mental health community, Papish investigated the effect of one-time contact-based educational intervention compared to a 4-week mandatory psychiatric course on stigma of mental illness at a university. The curriculum included 2 methods of inquiring contact with people diagnosed with a mental disorder. Self-stigma has also been shown to affect self-esteem, which then affects hope, which then affects the quality of life among people with severe mental illness. And hope should play a central role in recovery. Narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy is an intervention designed to reduce internalized stigma and targets both hope and self-esteem. Their intervention replaces stigmatization myths with facts about illness and recovery, which leads to higher levels of self-esteem in clients. This may then reduce susceptibility to internalized stigma. Now, stigma leads to health inequalities, prompting calls for stigma change. Targeting stigma involves 2 different agendas. First, the services agenda attempts to remove stigma so people can seek mental health services, and the rights agenda tries to replace discriminations that robs people of rightful opportunities with affirming attitudes and behavior. The former is successful when there is evidence that people with mental illness are seeking services more or becoming better engaged. The latter is successful when there is an increase in the number of people with mental illness in the workforce who are receiving reasonable accommodations. The federal government has tackled this issue with landmark legislation such as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008, and the Americans with Disability Act in 1990. However, protections are not uniform across all subgroups due to, first, explicit language about inclusion and exclusion criteria in the statute or implementation rule. Second, vague statutory language that yields a variation in the interpretation about which groups qualify for protection. And third, incentives created by the legislation that affect specific groups differently. In my next lecture, we will review the history of mental illness.